So Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I am going to hand out a handout, which is why we have people so ready and willing to help. So I'm going to say a few words first. And because the time is late, we won't do an in-depth study, but there's going to be some great texts for you to take home. So this is, first of all, I want to say, what I didn't say at the beginning of the service, there are two mistakes in this week's program, which we put there on purpose. And anyone who finds either one of them gets to donate $1,000 to the synagogue if you come up and tell me that you found one of those two mistakes. It's just an tzedakah opportunity. We just put them right in there. Anyway, so Parshat Ve'era, we're still in the book of, we just started the book of Exodus last week. So a few things to say before we get into a little text study tonight. I said at the beginning of the service that anniversaries are profound times to reflect, whether they're anniversaries of a loved one's death, and in fact, the Yiddish word that we use for an anniversary of someone's death, Yortzeit, literally means time of the year, or the time of the year that a death takes place, affects us. I'm sure you've had the experience of grief coming up in your body as that time of year arrives. You don't need to look at a calendar even sometimes, and the grief itself might reappear at a moment because the time of year, the season, a holiday, the music or something reminds you that it's the time of year in which you lost somebody who was very deeply and profoundly a part of your life. Yortzeits or anniversaries have other profound implications. As I said, thinking back 6 years ago when Donald Trump was elected, how we felt then, and where we are now with a great deal of fear and anxiety about what will come, because we understand, were it to happen again, or somebody else from another state south of here were to become president, it could even be worse. So we live with that on this anniversary, knowing what we know. And this parsha, in which we get deep into the beginning of this plague season, this is the season in which Pharaoh becomes Pharaoh. Pharaoh becomes Pharaoh. Pharaoh turns from being a king to being what we call the Pharaoh of these slaves. Hardened heart that makes it impossible for him to become a leader of liberation or of compassion. We have in this week's Parsha this intense story of watching the pain of Bnei Yisrael. And last week, I talked a lot about Martin Luther King's theology being the Exodus theology, because he believed in the parallels of the struggles of the children of Israel with the struggles of slaves of African descent here in this country. And the identification was with Bnei Yisrael. But there's another story to be told, of course, in the Exodus story, which is what we learn from Pharaoh. We could learn both from the experience of oppression that Bnei Yisrael experienced and the process and difficulty of moving out of oppression into some kind of freedom. But there's also a lot to learn in these Exodus stories about how not to become Pharaoh. There's both the positive expression of identity with Bnei Yisrael, and there's the negative identity of how not to become the oppressor. This, unfortunately, liberation movements throughout history have not done a great job. Liberation movements throughout history have been very good at throwing off an oppressor and not so good at not becoming corrupt and oppressing in their place. And of course, many of us are looking at what's happening in Israel right now with the most far right-wing government ever elected in the history of the state of Israel, where the absolute agenda of this government is to completely do away with the independent judiciary, which has been the bulwark of rights and freedoms in Israel. But that's not actually my talk for tonight. But it is something that we watch a lot of people who are oppressed becoming oppressor, becoming Pharaoh. And it's one of the remarkable stories of this book of ours that is a story of how we go from being the oppressed people and not become the Pharaoh. That turns out to be a harder lesson to learn than one might think. But today is also another anniversary, and this weekend has some other interesting anniversaries that I want to highlight in the midst of this question of whose heart gets hardened, and how do we soften our own hearts, and how do we not become Pharaoh, and how do we experience the story of Exodus. So on January 20th, 50 years ago, another president had his second inauguration, and that was Richard Nixon. And that was, by the way, I was 14 years old, and it was my first demonstration in Washington, D.C. I went with Marcia Wenck. We went down to Washington, D.C. to protest the inauguration of Richard Nixon on January 20th, 50 years ago today. It was not a Friday that year. I think it was a Monday or something, but I don't remember exactly. It wasn't a Friday. And that was my first time in Washington, D.C. Some of you might not remember that inaugural address. It's not one of the great ones of American history. But I do want to read one line from it, talking about pharaohs in our time, for those of us who remember. Some of us also remember John F. Kennedy's great speech about ask not what your country can do for you, but what you could do for your country. You know that line? Here was Nixon's twist on it. In our own lives, let each of us ask, not just what our government will do for me, but what I can do for myself. Okay, enough said about that inauguration. 50 years ago. True, I'm reading from the speech. There's some things I don't make up. There are some things I make up. 2 days after Richard Nixon was inaugurated in his second inauguration, the Supreme Court issued the decision Roe versus Wade. So this weekend we observe a major 50th anniversary of Nixon's ultimate demise, of course, as president, but one could argue that in that presidency and in some of the elements of that presidency were laid some of the foundations for the world in which we find ourselves today. And then the response to Roe versus Wade, of course, I don't need to go through all of it for each of us here today. But when that decision came out on January 22nd, 1973, making this the 50th anniversary of that decision, the world, of course, exploded. Here in New York State, for those of us who are New Yorkers might be interested to know, abortion was legal here in New York, but only for 2 years. And in those 2 years, New York State Senate passed laws each year trying to repeal that. And it was only because we had the Democratic governor that didn't happen. But this was very divisive here in New York State. But during those 2 years when abortion was legal here in New York State, but not in the rest of the country, 48% of the abortions here in the United States were for people outside of New York State. We are, of course, facing a very similar reality today. On the same day that Roe versus Wade was issued, Lyndon Baines Johnson died at the age of 64. Both obviously have some interesting Texas connections, but we won't explore those right now. So in honor of this, and now I need some help distributing a few texts. This is my gift to take home, and I'm going to study a few of them with you now. So in honor of this anniversary, the National Council of Jewish Women has been really at the center of the Jewish fight for reproductive justice. The National Council of Jewish Women has had a Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, who has really been one of the leading rabbis in America working on this issue. And they have taken a position that limiting access to abortion violates the First Amendment of the United States, because for Jews, access to abortion is aligned with our Jewish practice. Now, there's a lot of debate about under what situation, but absolute, so that's a concept to blow your mind, right? That it could actually be a violation of religious practice to say that one cannot have access to abortion. So I want to look at a couple of texts, but do take this home with you. If there, I don't know if we probably don't have exactly enough copies, but, and I think, yes, and we're sharing it online as well. We're going to look at the first text, which is from the book of Exodus. And I'm going to ask people to, and Danya Ruttenberg, who's a friend of mine, has written some commentary, which is fun to read as well, and we don't have time now. But I want to show you a couple of the key texts that establish what is the Jewish orthodox, halachic, legal position on these issues, which I think very few of us understand. It's not just an issue of red versus blue states. So in the book of Exodus, this very famous text, when men fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life. In other words, if the woman is hurt. Now, we're going to avoid the sexism and patriarchy for a moment. To understand the legal category that's being established here is that what is the status of the fetus in this situation? It's not personhood. If it were personhood, then it would be a death sentence, because in biblical law, if there is a death of a person, there's a death, whatever you call it. You know, got a lot of lawyers here. Anyway, so clearly, this biblical text is used to establish that Judaism does not see the fetus as a person and doesn't have the same legal status, doesn't have the same legal protections for it. As I said, I don't mean ignore all the other issues. I'm happy to teach this text otherwise, but just to zero in on this. So the next text from the Talmud. In cases of capital law, the dispute concerning such a prohibition is with regard to the issue that is the subject of the dispute, blah, blah, blah. If men struggle and they hurt a pregnant woman, and if there shall be a tragedy, you shall give life for a life. The reference is for a monetary payment for the life of that he took. The tragedy is the unintentional killing of the mother. So in other words, the human being. This is about what should happen if the mother is killed. So quickly moving through these. Page, the one that starts, now I should have known, it's Mishnah Ohalot. There's a little number 5 on my page. If a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb, because her life before the life of a child. But if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for another. So in other words, the legal definition is, what is the status of the birth of the fetus? If the fetus is more than 50% out of the woman's body, then the doctor has to make a very difficult medical decision. But if the birth is not, if the fetus is still part of inside the woman, there's no question in Jewish law. That is an amazing concept. So then the question becomes, okay, under what and there's a lot of texts here that are really fantastic, but we don't have the time tonight, but I'm sending them home with you for your pleasure reading. On page 8 of 12. So then the issue is concerned, it's clear if the woman is in physical danger, the fetus does not have standing. So there's no question if there's a medical situation, an actual medical danger to the life of the woman, no question about it. So what's amazing about Jewish law, and this is true for contemporary halakha, which is, you see there's a halachic on the next page 9. I'm going to skip to this. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who is a contemporary, 1978, halachic paskin. So that it is clear and obvious that a Jew is not killed for the fetus. But what happens if there is something besides physical danger to the woman? So we have an understanding, and down lower on the page, even without it, but only to save her from her evil, which can cause her great pain. And how the rabbis define that is if there's tremendous possibility of emotional or mental trauma. So Jewish law is very clear. It does not accept on the surface elective abortion. That's where the Orthodox would be very, would not accept that. However, if a woman can prove to her rabbi, and yes, in some cases they would have to use a rabbi, but Jewish law is very clear about this, that there is some condition in which there would be tremendous emotional pain or mental pain, the abortion is absolutely acceptable by Jewish standards. On this basis, there are whole groups now of lawyers in the Jewish world preparing to litigate this on First Amendment. I don't think it's going to be very successful given the world we're in, but I think it's a pretty fantastic moment to see. And for us to understand in this moment, on the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, the position that the Jewish community is in, discomforted in its connection to the right-wing Christian world, in which there's great cultural compatibility. There's a tremendous struggle to figure out the relationships itself to abortion right now. So January 22nd, 1973 is called by many as the day that changed America. So we learned and talked a lot last week about Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King. And honestly, without Lyndon Baines Johnson, the greatest victories that King was able to see would not have happened. Had Johnson not had the Vietnam War as his albatross, so to speak, he would be seen as the greatest civil rights president since Abraham Lincoln. It is a remarkable reality of what the perspective is. So as we move through these parshiot and these anniversaries, January 22nd, Roe v. Wade, LBJ dies, Nixon is inaugurated, and in February of 1973, CBST had its first Shabbat service. This is the world in which this synagogue began. And next Friday night, we will begin the celebration of the 50 years of CBST's existence. And you'll see in your Shabbat program on page 8 and 9, we sent out an email yesterday that we're taking Rabbi Cohen's book, and every month we're taking a chapter from the book and taking one Friday night in the course of the year to explore that chapter by having different voices of congregants. Next week are 2 Cooperberg Master Rabbinical interns who were not born in 1973, nor were they born in 1983 or 1993. They will interview Saul Zalkin and Regina Linder, our 2 members who were born in that time, and we're going to have a multi-generational conversation about the founding of CBST. And so there'll be a Friday night each month for this anniversary year, exploring the book and all of the people that make up the community. And we know this question of when is a heart hardened and when is it softened? When do the oppressed become oppressors? And when we have to learn from those who are enslaved struggling for freedom, and how do we not become the pharaohs that oppress others, is deep within these 50 years. And in all different kinds of ways, we too struggle with that question. So in this year of celebrating 50 years of many different things, may we continue to look for the way of softening our own hearts, not becoming the pharaohs in the world, and making sure we continue to be an agent for the liberation of all those enslaved in our world. Shabbat Shalom.